Aleister Crowley was an influential and controversial figure in the realm of occultism and mysticism. Born in England, Crowley became known as a prolific writer, poet, and practitioner of various esoteric traditions. Throughout his life, Crowley engaged in numerous esoteric practices, including ritual magic, divination, yoga, and meditation. He formed his own magical order, the Ordo Templi Orientis, which integrated elements of sex magic and explored the spiritual significance of sexuality. Aleister Crowley's legacy remains a subject of fascination, with his ideas and practices continuing to be studied and debated by occultists, scholars, and enthusiasts seeking to explore the depths of the human psyche and the mysteries of the universe.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to MP Paranormal. This is our third episode of our podcast, The Dead Shall Talk. Fair warning, before we begin, we will be discussing the occult, occultism, specifically Aleister Crowley, kind of defined what we understand as Western esotericism or occultism as we understand it today. Now, we're not going to be teaching you how to do rituals and summoning demons and all that nasty stuff, but we're going to be talking about him and his life and what he did and some of the books that he wrote. So, our disclaimer that makes you uncomfortable, now is a good time to off-ramp. Watch something else that will...
Like one of our investigation videos.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, off-ramp. Off-ramp to one of our vids. But fair warning, fair disclaimer is over. So we will be discussing today Aleister Crowley. Now, Aleister Crowley was born as Edward Alexander Crowley on October 12th of 1875 in Royal Leamington Spa, England. Now, he was born to a wealthy brewing heir, his father, Edward Crowley, and his wife, Emily. Now, Aleister Crowley was raised in a strict Christian household as a member of the Plymouth Brethren. This was a very, very conservative denomination. So he grew up in a very strict household, which was very juxtaposed to the way he lived and carried out his life and some of the orders and things that he got involved in and helped formulate. But his father actually passed away when Aleister Crowley was 11, and this had a very significant impact on him, losing his father at such a young age. And this kind of speaks to, you know, just growing up, right? Like when we're teenagers, we do crazy stuff. We rebel naturally, right? We don't want to do what mom and dad say just because we're trying to figure out who we are as a person, right? So it's kind of this coming of age, but Crowley kind of took it all the way to his grave, so to speak. And he didn't just rebel against, you know, his father and his mother, their conservative denomination and Christian faith. He was very much so going against the status quo of the time and just about every aspect of life as we understood it in the late 1800s and the early 1900s.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
go ahead.
No, all right. So I'll pick it up. So after his father died and he kind of went through life, right? He, in 1898, he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is an influential cult group at the time. And that exposed him to ritual magic and is it Kabbalah or Kabbalah?
It's kind of like tomato.
Okay, I got you. However, like the internal conflicts that he was having with his spiritualism and his personal identity and his childhood traumas and all these things kind of prompted him to go seek more knowledge. So that led him to a trip in Egypt in 1904. And Crowley claimed to receive a divine revelation from a spiritual entity named Aiwass. And in this revelation, which he described as the Book of Law, which is actually a book that he wrote himself. And Brian, I know you know a little bit about the story about the Book of Law and how that came to writing, so I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so the Book of the Law is kind of like his first book on spiritualism. Now, when he was growing up and his education, he, you know, like we said, he was an heir of an extremely wealthy brewing company. His father was the owner, Crowley's Ale. And so he got a very nice education. He grew up in Cambridge University, which was one of the top colleges of the time. And throughout this time, you know, his rebellious nature kind of didn't stop. He was known to pay prostitutes for sex. And during that time, he actually contracted gonorrhea. And he actually discovered that he was bisexual in Cambridge University, having a same-sex relationship in that time, right? And they were quite open about it. And so his first lover, male lover, so to speak, kind of broke away from him when Crowley decided that this Western esotericism, occultism, if you will, was his thing. So they kind of broke up, and that breakup actually stayed with him for an extremely long time. But fast forward to April of 1904, right? He's married to his first wife, and they're on their honeymoon, right? So to kind of set the stage, they're actually in Cairo, and they're staying near this place called the Bulak Museum, with a very nice furnished apartment. He was wealthy. They're having this honeymoon, and on the 8th, 9th, and 10th of April, 1904, between the hours of noon and 1 p.m. in the flats, he described this being talking to him over his left shoulder. And this being, right, he heard it over his left shoulder, and it was communicating things. And he described kind of like what this entity sounded like. It sounded like a deep, somber timbre, not having a native accent or a foreign accent. So he was trying to put into words, he was a poet. He had several published poems that he wrote when he was in college. He was trying to beautifully describe this account of this voice that came out of the ether and spoke to him. In 3 days and 3 hours, he wrote this entire book, the Book of the Law. And all of these were instructions by this being Aiwass or Awas that was speaking to him from seemingly the ether. And that wouldn't be the first book that he wrote. He wrote many, many more books. And I would like to talk about a personal experience I had reading one of his books. We're going to get into more of the topics of what his books talked about, but I'll briefly touch. So this book is called The Paris Working, and it's a series of sexual magic, right? This is why we gave a fair warning at the beginning, right? And throughout this, he talks about restoring the worship of several gods of pagan antiquity. And throughout this, he wrote this design or this spiritual practice where you could make love or have sex or masturbate and use that to will some of your own desires into existence, specifically touching on the differences, getting very specific about magic revolving around having relationships with a woman and relationships with a man, and how that affects your spirituality and gives you these occulted powers, so to speak. Anyway, I made it to about page 16 of this book. Started to feel incredibly ill. The account of this book, it was talking about, once again, he was hearing a voice or speaking to an entity, opening up doorways. And so he would create a room and he would call it the temple, and the temple doorway would be opened. And that's how these things would come through and communicate with him. And he had an assistant with him at the time, basically invoke this spirit or this entity or this god inside of him, and it would speak through these people, which to me sounds like demonic possession. And he would have a conversation with his apprentice, but they believed they were speaking to the god Mercury. Throughout that, the god Mercury had two forms. It was that of a little boy and that of a grown kingly man, which also has several relationships with kind of occultism, like the Lesser Key of Solomon, the Goetia, understanding demons, invocations, evocations. So this is really dangerous stuff, right? He's exploring the unknown. He's exploring talking to gods, to deities, and something that translates over, at least the way you and me would understand it, is a possession, right? And in our first episode, if you go back, if you haven't watched it already, check it out. We actually talk about Father Amorth and demonic possession in the Catholic Church. So he's doing this stuff, right? And he's recording them and he's publishing these books in the early 1900s about his apprentice being possessed, about him talking to these gods of antiquity, the old gods, right? So he's going against everything at the time and writing about homosexuality and how it's beneficial, and just completely going against the status quo. And those are just two books that he wrote. He has several publications that he's come out with. And like I said, read those books. If you're going to read those books, be very careful. I recommend that you do not. But it's very strange works that he wrote. That's just one experience I had personally. And if, I've heard other people said they've read Crowley's books and had strange experiences and whatnot. So if you know anything, feel free to leave us a comment, but we'll go ahead and move on.
Yeah, I remember you texted me that day and you're like, dude, I made a mistake. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And you're like, bro, I just had the most like awful experience reading out of this book. I was like, what book did you read? And you're like, dude, I read Aleister Crowley book. And it was kind of like what we were talking about last episode. Like these words have like vibrational, like how the Bible says that God like willed the universe into existence. Like he breathed it into existence. Like the vibrational energy of him like created these things. And
I became so sick that I retched over the toilet. Pretty sure I was going to projectile vomit. And at that point, I grabbed my holy water. I anointed myself. I said, sorry, God, I didn't realize reading a book could have this kind of energy. I opened up a window and I told whatever this vibe was in my room, in my house, to get the F out. I used Jesus' name and that worked. We haven't had problems since.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the thing about this podcast. It's like Aleister Crowley, master Satanist or misunderstood mystic. You know what I mean? Like, what was this dude really doing? And rolling off of what you were saying, like after he had these revelations and these visions, like he spent the rest of his life like promoting Thaloma and engaging in various controversial behaviors, including like drug experimentation and sexual liberation. These practices, coupled with like his often sensational and self-aggrandizing like texts, caught him like a lot of notoriety in the press. And we're going to talk about the Order of Thaloma. But before we do that, we got to talk about the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was an influential secret society founded in London in the 19th century. And it devoted study and practice of the occult, metaphysics, and paranormal activities, which is awesome for us because we love that stuff. And it played a significant role in the revival of interest in magic during the 19th and 20th centuries. And it was founded by 3 Freemasons. A lot of people think like associate Freemasons as like the ultimate secret society, right? And these 3 dudes.
You said Freemasons? Freemasons are the one that established this order?
Yeah. So they essentially, I mean, it's not written anywhere, but I assume that they broke away from the Masonic Brotherhood, the Masonic fraternity, and wanted to start their own thing. So they came over and started the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And those 3, those 3 dudes were William Robert Woodman, William Wynne Westcott, and Samuel Liddell Mathers. And it's either noted 1887 or 1888. And they claim that the organization was based off of a set of cipher manuscripts detailing the outlines of a series of magical initiation rituals. They also claim to be in contact with a group of spiritual entities known as the Secret Chiefs, which I thought was really fascinating. And these Secret Chiefs were the true directors of the orders. Like these guys were zealots. Like they were like doing thy bidding. Like, what is thy bidding? You know what I mean? And like perpetuating that. Go ahead.
It's metal, dude.
Yeah. Like, yeah, what is thy bidding? And they would like learn from these deities and these entities, and they would like share that information with their followers. And
Well, where do they get these rituals and teachings from? It sounds like it's kind of a mishmash.
well, I mean, that's kind of the thing with like Crowley that we'll get like the listeners like you'll get a hint of is that it comes from all over the world. So like you have like Christian mysticism, Kabbalah, Hermeticism. Crowley himself influenced Order of the Golden Dawn, Freemasonry, alchemy, so on and so forth, astrology, and it was organized in a hierarchy, and members moved through a series of ranks, as you could see from the influence of the Masonic order, is that different ranks in the Scottish Rite and the English Rite and stuff like that. And they had some notable members that we took down here. We're not exactly sure who these individuals were, but they were like authors and poets and rich people, right? The names that we got: W.B. Yeats, author Arthur Machen, and Aleister Crowley himself. That was a tongue twister.
Job.
Yeah, and Crowley's relationship with the order was a bit fraught. like throughout Crowley's life, as we'll talk about, going through these different orders that he joined and established, like he was always in a position of like authority. Like he always wanted to be in control of the whole situation and orchestrating the rituals and the magic and the information and all that stuff, which kind of like led to like the dissolvement of the order because of the conflict that was broken out because Crowley wanted to rule the order.
So after this golden dawn was kind of dissolved, you said Crowley wanted to be in control. He wanted to be in power. So he went off and made his own kind of cult or order. It's called Thelema, the Rituals of Thaloma. It's a philosophy, right? It's a religious movement created by Aleister Crowley himself. Within this order of Thelema, these rituals are typically categorized: daily rituals, initiation, and other rites. The rituals are often complex. These things include numerous elements: recitations, invocations, the use of symbolic objects and actions. We're going to go over a few of the key rituals. We're not going to teach you how to do them, right? We're not preaching black magic or anything of the sort. We're just going to briefly go over them. One of these rituals was called Liber Resh Vel Helios. And Helios, right? That means the sun. And this was actually a ritual performed 4 times a day. It was at dawn, noon, sunset, and midnight. Aim of this ritual was to attune the participant to the sun's cycle itself. So at each solar event 4 times a day, the practitioner would face the sun or its imagined location if you can't see the sun, and make specific gestures, if you will, and invocations related to different Egyptian solar deities.
I was just going to say that the first thing that popped into my head is like, that sounds very similar to like ancient Egypt and how King Tut's, like I always butcher his name, Tutankhamun's father made it a monotheistic empire, if you will, where they worshipped Ra, who is the one and only God, the God of the sun, right? Which I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, we can briefly touch on like the Egyptian tradition, right? When Tutankhamun came into power and his father passed away, he kind of set out to rebel and bring back the traditions of the Egyptian faith. So they went from monotheism back to polytheism. And, Egyptians actually had over 1,000 different gods. We know a few by name today, one of the most popular probably being Anubis or Thoth, right? Well, we'll go ahead and we'll talk about some other rituals. There's another one called Liber Samik. This was a ritual considered as an advanced magical operation. And I found this to be really interesting. It was designed to achieve conversation with your holy guardian angel. And Crowley describes this as a pivotal spiritual event for any kind of practitioner of the occult. Throughout this, it involves extensive invocation and visualization, which I thought was fascinating because, even in modern society today, we think of the guardian angel, right? Saint Michael. He's the guardian angel of first responders. People kind of revere that. Guardian angels are revered even today. Now, what guardian angel specifically, was kind of in their practice, I'm not sure of, but it probably varied from, Saint Michael or some of the archangels that we understand today.
Yeah, and also like people like guardian angels, like that could be like a personal thing to them, like spirits of family members or whatever that get their wings, go up to heaven and become angels and give them protection, however you want to interpret it. But yeah, it is the holy guardian angel. But yeah, like when I think of like the top dog guardian angel, I think of Saint Michael as well. Like he's the general of God's army. You know what I mean? So it's just interesting, like the Christian like mysticism and like that theology around that, and that he was just like picking so many different parts of these religions and ideologies. It's really, really fascinating. The next one we want to talk about, and it's probably the last one we'll talk about, is the lesser and greater rituals of the pentagram. And just remember, like, and I'll have Brian explain this in a second, but there's 2 versions of the pentagram, right? There's the regular pentagram and then there's the pentagram inverted, right? Which is associated with modern like satanic practices, right? So Brian, you just want to touch on like a little bit of the pentagram?
Yeah, so the upright pentagram is not a symbol of evil. It's a symbol that kind of symbolizes four elements, obviously fire, water, earth, fire, and the uppermost, the top point of the star, right? It's the Akash, it's the ether, it's the spiritual realm. So they consider this to be an element in and of itself, right? And the lesser and greater rituals of the pentagram, is Aleister Crowley kind of did it. These are banishing rituals, banishing these four different kinds of elements plus the one.
Yeah, and
They would need to, they would need to basically cleanse the area of any kind of unwanted spiritual elemental energy to make sure that their ritualistic practice is successful and there's no interference from outside influences or forces, if you will.
yeah, and we don't know whether it was traditional, like because like Wicca like practices this a lot. Like they use the pentagram upright, in a lot of their rituals, and because Wicca is really revolving around the earthly and the spirits of like you said, like fire, earth, water, worshiping the sun and the moon and all that stuff. And we don't know if he was doing it that way or the dark side of it, right? Who knows? But
The pentagram is, supposed to be this extremely powerful symbol when it's upright. It signifies the cross. It signifies five archangels. It signifies the five elements, right? It's this extremely powerful symbol. And what have Satanists done with it? They've inverted it, right? So it's upside down. So the upright pentagram represents humanity ascending in levels of consciousness in a positive, good way. And obviously inverted, it's the dissension of the human consciousness in a very negative and evil way. And I think what we see the pentagram today, or we see a star, we're like, witch, it's like this, you're a witch, you're evil, you study witchcraft, when it's like really these symbols go way back. These symbols go extremely far back. And, obviously it's like inverting the cross, right? Like that's obviously the antichrist and evil. So we take these symbols and we invert them. What did Hitler do? The Nazi symbol, right? He inverted that one as well. That I forget what tradition
it's a Hindi.
swastika.
I think it's Hindi.
Yeah, it represents peace, love, harmony, like many good things, and he inverted it, right? So humanity has done this over the ages and over time, and it's important to to me, it's kind of important to study these things and their symbolism and what they actually mean, and not necessarily practicing this stuff, but having like a greater understanding of the way humanity tries to put our faith or our understanding of the environment and the universe within these symbols, right? So, the pentagram, the way Crowley was using it was, I would assume it was inverted, but the pentagram is an extremely like potent and magical symbol.
Yeah, and we have to talk about assumptions because we don't really know. Because like one of the things that we realized when we were researching Crowley is there was a lot of warnings about being very careful researching Aleister Crowley because he was surrounded by a lot of sensationalism, right? Because there was not like these were secret societies, like people weren't in there taking notes. Like I'm sure that there was words spoken from followers down the road about what was happening and stuff like that, but we don't want to like we're trying to figure out and talking about this like was he a Satanist, was he diving into evil, or was he just like misunderstood, and was he like pulling from all these different cultures in the pursuit of like knowledge and insight and consciousness elevation and all these things, right? But he was doing all this under the umbrella of the Magickal Order of Thaloma, right? Which was actually the OTO, Ordo Templi Orientis, or the Order of the Temple of the East, right? And he became involved with the order in the early 20th century and became its leader, integrating his Thelemic philosophy into his teachings and rituals. So we get a narrative here, right? Like he is so set on infiltrating all of these orders and kind of like pushing his narrative about what's real versus what he thought was not real. Fighting for power in the Order of the Golden Dawn, and then infiltrating the OTO and rising to power there. The OTO was originally modeled after the Masonic structure, again, just like the Golden Dawn. And its teachings were lacking in the esoteric and occult aspects because it was very influenced by Freemasonry. And when Crowley took over he transformed the OTO into a Thelemic order, and he revised his rituals to reflect Thelemic doctrines and introduced new degrees, so levels and rankings based around his systems of sex magic. And another order that is associated with Thelema, although not a magical order, was the AA, the Astrum Argentum, which is also known as the Silver Star. And this was another organization created by Crowley as a spiritual and magical teaching structure. And unlike the OTO, it's a fraternal and an initiatory order. The AA, it's a teaching and testing system with the purpose of guiding its students towards spiritual enlightenment. And it's worth noting that a lot of this independent groups in the world today now identify with Thelema and conduct rituals and its teachings based on Crowley's work. And what I did read upon it is that the interpretations and the practices like vary wildly, like from group to group, but like it was extremely influential to all these different orders and secret societies around the world today.
So, I mean, the topic of like sex magic, it's so like radical to me. So I just want to touch up a little bit. Bear with me as I talk about this stuff, obviously. But so Crowley preached masturbatory sexual magic, autosexual, called it autosexual magical technique. And this was in a book that he called The Lesser Work of Soul. He talked about heterosexual magic techniques. He also talked about anal intercourse and homosexual magic techniques. He believed that because of our human nature, right? He believed each individual had an absolute right to satisfy this instinct to how it seems proper for them. And without this, like he believed that doing practices and like aligning yourself sexually with other people for a greater purpose. So they believed that this gave birth or gave fruition to what they wanted out of life, essentially. Very radical concept, right? Very, very strange. It's very against Christianity, right? You're supposed to be like celibate, ritual chastity. It's the way we understand priests and all that, dedicating their lives to God. And that's how they're able to give you communion, because they've obtained that and they've given up that. Well, he was just like, screw that. Let's have sex and do as much as we want and use this energy or this will to achieve what we want on this earth.
Yes,
his thought.
And his go-to, just like with the Hellfire Club, like he took that influence, do as thou wilt, right? And that's why my mind drifts more to, so like with these rituals and with these things, like it's like yin and yang, right? You have the light side of things, like light-based and shadow-based. And in our modern understanding of the holy and the divine, that's like the light-based, right? But all the things that he's doing go completely against that. So that's why it makes me think that he's more down the rabbit hole of like the shadow-based, communing with dark spirits and dark gods and goddesses and deities to draw power and knowledge from. That's just my thought on it.
So on that, right, like this whole pantheon, if you will, of different gods and goddesses used in this Ordo Templi Orientis, right? OTO.
Now known as at this point, as the Magickal Order of Thaloma.
Right. There were key figures within this, right? A lot of them were Egyptian. Nuit, Hadit, and Ra or Kuit. And he talks about these entities in the Book of the Law, which was that first book that he wrote. And I'll briefly go over what these gods represent, right? So Nuit represents the infinite and the totality of all possibilities, potentialities of existence. She is often equated with the night sky and the universe. Hadit is seen as the infinitely small complement to Nuit, a point of consciousness, an experience that moves through Nuit's expanse. So Hadit is often associated with the concept of the individual soul. So Nuit's the universe, Hadit's the individual soul, and Ra-Hor Kuit is a manifestation of Horus, the Egyptian god of the sky and of kingship. He's also viewed, oddly enough, as the god of war and vengeance. And in Thelema, he actually represents the active aspect to Nuit's passivity. He's also seen as a god of Thelema's new Ayon, or new era of spiritual evolution.
Yeah, and
Go ahead.
oh yeah, and with that, like he incorporated not just like Egyptian deities only, right? And it kind of gets it like for this, like the Magickal Order of Thaloma, right? It kind of revolves around more diverse spectrum of deities and gods. So like Egyptian, Greek, Gnostic, Christian, Eastern traditional, all that stuff. Like we're going to get into the Typhonian Lodge here in a second, which is like, we'll talk about that in a second, which is like the darker side of this. But like all these rituals and stuff like involve like various gods. But it's important to remember that Thelema, these figures are typically understood symbolically rather than as literal beings to be worshipped, or so he said. But I find like a hard time to believe that, especially with your experience reading that passage about him like invoking Mercury into his body, or what he thought was Mercury, right? You know, he said that they served as metaphors for various spiritual.
I'm not. I would say no. I think these things were literal. To be honest with you.
Yeah, like I agree with you, and he's like I was about to say, like he said that they serve as metaphors and various spiritual and psychological states, cosmic principles, or stages on the path to discovering one's true will. I think
I think that was the save face.
that yeah, I was literally just about to say that's how he was selling it, but like I think like he was so deep into this, like he really wanted to commune with any spirit that he could, and or you know,
In addition to those three, I want to touch up one of them that stuck out. I mean, we spoke about those three. There was Aiwass, right? There's also Babylon, Baphomet, Chaos, Ma'at, and Therion, which Babylon and Baphomet, I mean, those are the way we understand them, right? Those are extremely like high level demons. And these are the deities associated with Thelema. So it's not just like, oh, we're worshiping these gods of old and they're metaphorical. Like this is some seriously like dark stuff.
yeah, 100%. Like, and also to me, like communing with a great god, or like,
It's not a trivial thing.
yeah, like I think, and to me, like, and we talk about like our experiences with the demonic and all that stuff. Like demons are much more willing to commune with you than I think. I don't know if willing or more willing, or it's easier to get in contact with them, because they say that the God rules the heaven and the earth is ruled by Satan, or whatever interpretation of, culture calls Satan, right? So like I feel like it'd be a lot easier for something to say like, hey, I'm Mercury, like how are you, like let's talk, you know what I mean? Like, but who knows like what this dude was doing and behind closed doors, like was he really, I don't know. That's what's so fascinating about him.
I mean, he wrote books about him, but if you're going to delve into that, extreme caution if you want to figure out the text and actually read these things.
Yeah, for sure. Because the biggest controversy that surrounds the name of Aleister Crowley has to be the Typhonian Lodge, which was carried forward by one of his followers, whose name was Kenneth Grant. Right. He was said that he was given given the right to carry forward the order. Right. And he called it the Typhonia Lodge. And this lodge was literally the embodiment of chaos and destruction. Like they literally, it's in the name. Typhonian refers to the Egyptian god Set, who is associated with chaos, storms, and disorder. Like
throughout that, right? So, I mean, we have Kenneth Grant. He broke off and made this Typhonian Order. There are Typhonian lodges today. You can Google this stuff. They're all throughout the freaking country, man.
Yeah.
Like I think I came across a Facebook page. It was like the Typhonian Lodge of like Ohio or something. I'm like, what? So I mean, this stuff is like being practiced today. These orders and these lodges are alive and well today, and they're operating and they're recruiting and doing all this. They're doing their thing even today. And it all started with what Aleister Crowley and his life. It all kind of started with that. But it's under Grant's leadership, right? This Typhonian Order, it took a different path than the Thelemic orders. Like you said, it was very heavy emphasis on this darkness. And he actually coined this darkness as the tunnels of Set, who's an Egyptian god as well. It was interpreted as this dark, subconscious aspect of the human psyche. It also incorporated elements of like other mystical and magical traditions, including Hindu Tantra and the works of H.P. Lovecraft, which I thought was incredibly interesting. I mean, H.P. Lovecraft doesn't go back to biblical times unless maybe he was incorporating some kind of like a cult classic, if you will, into his modern day teaching. It's kind of like the Star Wars effect, right? Like everyone believes the Force may be with you and things like that. And it's kind of like this other sect of spirituality. I thought it was interesting how he latched onto H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah, like also just like modern or like at the time when he was alive, right? So modern sensationalism with like literature and publishings, right? And maybe like H.P. Lovecraft was like the brain, talked about Cthulhu and all that stuff, and he was like, oh, that's probably, I don't know how it went through his brain, but probably it was like something infectious to him that he wanted to incorporate into his teachings.
But other than that, the group's main focus on the personal exploration and development of the individual, with a heavy emphasis on direct experience, including practices like ceremonial magic, sexual magic, dream work, and astral projection. We could go down the rabbit hole on all four of those topics. They could be their own podcast, right? I'm super excited to talk about astral projection again.
Yeah, and it's just like he carries forward his teacher's teachings, right? The first two, ceremonial magic and sexual magic, but then starts to put his own thoughts into things like dream work and astral projection. Like we couldn't find anything on dream work and astral projection with Aleister Crowley. Maybe he did talk about it, or it could be that Mr. Grant, that was his own ideologies and like his perception of spiritualism and consciousness awakening and stuff like that. But yeah, so
There's actually another individual during this time who was kind of the direct antithesis of Aleister Crowley. His name was Samael Ayon Weor. This was 1917. I think he passed away in 1977. He taught white sexual magic. And basically, through this practice, a man and a woman come together, but neither of them orgasm or ejaculate. And what he taught was this sexual energy was then, instead of releasing, right, the way we understand good relations, right, like you reach an orgasm, right? He was just like, no, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
And he believed that this energy that was supposed to expel from your body, he believed that it went up your spine and went into the pineal gland.
And that
and
tantric stuff?
Yes, but he believed this is kind of like the more like less dark side of it. I believe that instead of giving in, like you can give in, but transmute that energy alchemy, right, into something positive to increase your human consciousness, which we all know. We've all read about the pineal gland and like binaural beats and stuff the CIA did to astral project or meditate and things like that. So he used this practice to kind of go with meditation and visions and speaking to good gods, right? Speaking with not evil ones. So we could talk about him on another podcast. He's an incredibly influential person as well. But it's kind of interesting how, we think of priests or people like monks, right? What do? They become, they kind of break off. They live a monastic lifestyle. They kind of live alone and they meditate and then they receive these visions, right? So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And now that we've kind of covered everything, I just would like to say that it's just incredibly interesting that, the impact that this individual had. That's why they called him the father of the occult and the father of occult practices, is because his teachings, or whether they were dark or good, no one really knows because he was so sensationalized, right? That's why we wanted to talk about him. Like I said, I have my opinion that it was more dark based, but like he influenced and infiltrated just the minds of everybody, and it carried forward. Like everybody's like occult practices these days are influenced by Aleister Crowley, and I just think that's super interesting. And I don't think it'll ever change. Like this dude was just a what do they call it? Like a trailblazer in that field.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up this podcast about Aleister Crowley. If you haven't checked out our first two episodes, go ahead and check out our first two podcasts. They're very interesting, and we're going to be releasing these podcasts once a week. So if you liked what we talked about today, feel free to subscribe, give us a like, give us a comment, say hello. We'd love to chat with you. But other than that, we actually got an investigation video coming out, and this summer is jam-packed with all types of new places that we haven't been to that we're very excited to go to, investigate. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, it was a pleasure chatting with y'all. We'll look forward to you next time.
See you.